Friends, it just happened live. Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, walked into the most powerful room in Europe, stood in front of the cameras, looked directly at the institution that governs 450 million people, and said the one thing that every European leader has been too afraid to whisper behind closed doors. He said Ursula von der Leyen was never chosen by the people. He said she was placed into her position through backroom arrangements between political elites who needed a compliant face for an agenda that ordinary Europeans never approved and never asked for. He said her tenure at the head of the European Commission has not been a story of European strength. It has been a story of European citizens being systematically overtaxed, overruled, and overridden by a bureaucratic structure that answers to nobody they voted for. And then he said the words that are now being repeated in every major European capital in 6 languages across every platform that exists. She needs to resign immediately, unconditionally, without negotiation. The room went silent for 3 full seconds after he said it. 3 seconds where every journalist, every aide, every official standing in that space processed what they had just heard. Because there is a precise and non-negotiable difference between a politician criticizing EU leadership and a sitting prime minister of a G7 nation publicly demanding the resignation of the European Commission president on live television in front of the world. The first is politics. The second is a detonation. And Starmer just pulled the pin. Von der Leyen's face told the story before her office could spin it. Brussels has not seen anything like this. And what happens in the next 72 hours will determine whether the European Commission survives it. To understand why Starmer's statement has produced a crisis that the European Commission's entire institutional machinery cannot contain, you have to understand what made it different from every previous attack on von der Leyen's authority. Because she has faced criticism before, she has faced budget rebellions, legitimacy challenges, transparency scandals, and the accumulated fury of member state governments whose sovereignty her commission has systematically eroded. She has survived all of it, not because the criticism was wrong, because the critics were dismissible. When Viktor Orban attacks the commission, Brussels shrugs with the practiced confidence of an institution that has spent years constructing the political quarantine that surrounds him. He is labeled a nationalist disruptor, a difficult actor at the margins of the European project. His words land and are immediately contained by the framework that frames him as everything the EU was built to prevent. When Marine Le Pen's allies in the European Parliament challenge Commission authority, the establishment deploys the same mechanism. Far-right noise, anti-European sentiment dressed in democratic language. The label does the work. The criticism is absorbed and neutralized before it can spread into the mainstream conversation where it would actually matter. That mechanism has been the Commission's most reliable defense against accountability for years. It does not work on Keir Starmer. It cannot work on Keir Starmer because Starmer is not Orban. He is not a Eurosceptic firebrand whose entire political identity is constructed in opposition to the European project. He is the leader of a center-left government, a man who spent years as one of the most visible advocates for closer UK-EU cooperation after Brexit. A politician whose entire public identity is built on pragmatism, institutional respect, multilateralism, and the kind of careful evidence-based governance that the European Commission has always presented as its own defining characteristic. When a man like that stands up and says the institution is broken and the person running it has no democratic legitimacy, there is no label that contains it. There is no political quarantine that holds. There is only the statement sitting in the open air, impossible to dismiss and impossible to ignore. Brussels understood this within minutes. The response from von der Leyen's communications team arrived fast. But fast does not mean effective. The official statement deployed every word in the institutional crisis management vocabulary: partnership, shared values, constructive dialogue, transatlantic solidarity, language designed to sound serious while committing to absolutely nothing specific. And every political analyst in Europe read it for exactly what it was: a team in genuine panic trying to build a containment wall out of material that had already been made useless by the precision of what Starmer had said. Because he had not attacked a policy, He had not objected to a regulatory framework or a trade mechanism or a budget allocation. He had attacked the fundamental right of the person running the institution to hold power at all. And you cannot defend legitimacy with a press release. The substance of what Starmer exposed went far beyond the personal indictment of von der Leyen. He named the specific mechanism through which the Commission's unaccountable power translates into the daily lived reality of ordinary European citizens. He named the tax framework. The fiscal architecture being pushed through Brussels in the name of green transition, digital competitiveness, and economic modernization. A framework that was not designed through democratic deliberation, was not developed in response to the expressed needs of European citizens, and was not subjected to the kind of transparent public scrutiny that any elected government proposing measures of equivalent consequence would face as a basic condition of democratic legitimacy. It emerged from a closed process driven by technocratic priorities and external financial pressures that the European public was never informed about and never consulted on. And what it produces in practice, stripped of the bureaucratic language that Brussels uses to make its decisions sound inevitable and rational, is a series of financial burdens that land with their full crushing weight on the people who are least equipped to absorb them and who have the least political power to resist them. Energy levies that drive heating costs beyond what families in Poland and Romania and Bulgaria can manage through any adjustment to their existing household budgets. Carbon pricing mechanisms that push food prices higher in countries where real wages have been flat for a decade, while Commission officials collect salaries that insulate them entirely from the consequences of the policies they design. Digital transaction taxes that bleed small business owners who are already operating on margins so thin that a single bad quarter ends businesses that took years and everything their owners had to build. Starmer named every one of these. He did not speak in abstractions or fiscal architecture or regulatory harmonization. He talked about the woman in Warsaw who cannot pay her heating bill this winter and has no mechanism to hold accountable the people in Brussels who made that bill higher. He talked about the shop owner in Leyen drowning in compliance costs that the Commission invented, the Commission enforces, and the Commission will never personally absorb. He talked about the young couple in Madrid who both work full-time jobs and still cannot feed their children the way their own parents fed them on a single income a generation ago. And he said that von der Leyen designed and implemented and defended a system that makes every one of those lives measurably harder while serving interests that have nothing to do with European prosperity and everything to do with the perpetuation of unaccountable institutional power. He called it, with precise and deliberate language, a betrayal dressed up as governance. 6 words, and those 6 words landed in European political consciousness like a grenade with the pin already pulled. By the time European evening news programs went to air, it was the clip playing on loop across every major broadcaster on the continent. Not the Commission's response, not the institutional language, the grenade. A betrayal dressed up as governance, because those 6 words captured something that millions of Europeans had been unable to articulate clearly, but had been carrying in their bones for years. The feeling that the people running the continent are not running it for them, that the decisions emerging from Brussels are not the product of genuine concern for European citizens, but of an institutional momentum that has separated itself so completely from democratic accountability that it no longer even feels the need to perform the gestures of responsiveness that elected politicians must maintain to survive. And now the British Prime Minister had said it on the record, with his name attached to it, in front of the world, daring anyone with the standing to do so to tell him he was wrong. The German government's response to Starmer's statement was, in its own way, more devastating for von der Leyen than anything a declared critic could have produced, because the German government said almost nothing. Chancellor Friedrich Merz, whose own political position is under intense domestic pressure from an economy that has been underperforming for 2 consecutive years and a coalition held together by the narrowest of margins, did not appear before cameras to defend the Commission president. He did not issue a statement rebutting the substance of what Starmer had said. He did not stand publicly beside von der Leyen in the way that German institutional weight has historically functioned as the Commission's most reliable shield against external pressure. He issued a careful minimal, strategically empty statement about the importance of European unity that contained zero personal defense of von der Leyen and zero substantive engagement with the legitimacy question that Starmer had placed at the center of the European conversation. In the specific political language of Brussels, that silence is not neutrality. It is not Germany staying above the fray of a bilateral dispute between Britain and the Commission. It is a signal, precise, deliberate, and received with complete clarity by every government watching the situation develop across the continent. If Germany will not defend her when she is under direct and public attack from the leader of a G7 nation, if Berlin calculates that the cost of standing beside her outweighs the cost of allowing her to face the assault without institutional cover, then the question every smaller government is now asking privately has an answer that changes everything. If Berlin will not protect her, why should anyone? That question moving quietly through the diplomatic corridors of European power while von der Leyen's team attempts to manage the public damage is not a background anxiety. It is the central political fact of the crisis, because a Commission president without Germany's protection is not a president at all. She is a target. And Starmer just handed every frustrated government on the continent a vocabulary, a framework, and something more dangerous than either of those things, a permission slip. The permission slip that says the thing you have been thinking privately is now sayable publicly. That the cost of saying it has dropped because someone with real standing already said it first and the sky did not fall. The sky is still there, but Brussels is beginning to shake beneath it. And what von der Leyen decided to do in the 26 hours after Starmer's statement, the decision that her own allies are now privately describing as the single worst political miscalculation of her entire career, did not steady the ground. It cracked it open further, because instead of silence, instead of a measured gesture toward democratic humility, instead of any acknowledgement that public concern deserves to be heard by someone in her position, she did the one thing that every experienced political operator in Brussels was privately begging her not to do. She stood up in front of the European Parliament and she doubled down completely. And the word she used to describe her own position, one single word that her communications team should never have allowed near a microphone, became the most politically destructive word spoken in Brussels in a decade. What was that word? And why did a German MEP from a traditionally pro-European party stand up, walk toward the exit, stop at the door in front of waiting journalists, and deliver 7 words that became the headline across European media within the hour? 7 words that did more damage to von der Leyen's authority than everything Starmer had said the day before combined? The word was untouchable. Not spoken in those exact syllables, but communicated with the full, unmistakable weight of that meaning through every choice von der Leyen made in that parliamentary appearance. The tone, the framing, the absolute absence of any gesture toward the democratic humility that the moment demanded from someone in her position. She stood before the European Parliament 26 hours after Starmer's statement with the energy of a leader who had convinced herself that institutional confidence was the appropriate response to an institutional legitimacy crisis. She defended the tax framework without apology. She described her mandate as legitimate and her leadership as necessary. She dismissed the criticism as politically motivated interference from forces seeking to weaken European unity. And she said, with the calm authority of someone who has never had to face a real election and has never experienced the specific terror of watching public support collapse beneath you in real time, that difficult decisions require courageous leadership and that she would not be intimidated by pressure from outside the European Union. The applause from her bloc was immediate, but applause from your own bloc when the rest of the chamber is silent is not a political victory. It is a warning sign wearing a victory's clothing. And 3 MEPs did not wait for the speech to finish to deliver their verdict on what they were watching. They stood up, they walked toward the exit, not quietly, not apologetically, with the deliberate, visible public intention of people who understood exactly what their departure would communicate and had decided that communicating it was more important than any protocol that required them to stay seated. One of them, a German representative from a traditionally pro-European party whose entire career had been built on defending the institutional architecture that von der Leyen leads, stopped at the door. in front of the journalists who were already there, because experienced political reporters know that the door of a parliamentary chamber during a contested speech is where the real story happens. He stopped, he turned, and he said 7 words that became the lead headline across European media within the hour. She just confirmed everything her critics said. 7 words from inside the House, not from the Eurosceptic fringe, not from the nationalist bloc that Brussels had spent years politically quarantining. From a pro-European lawmaker who had spent their entire career defending the institution, now standing at the exit door and telling the watching world that the president had just proved her critics right while attempting to prove them wrong. That is not a political setback that a communications team can manage. That is a self-inflicted wound that goes all the way to the bone. The word untouchable spread the way only words that capture a pre-existing truth can spread. Not because journalists pushed it, but because the moment ordinary people heard it attached to von der Leyen's parliamentary performance, they recognized it immediately as the accurate description of something they had been watching for years, without having the precise language to name. Within 3 hours of the parliamentary session ending, untouchable was the banner headline across Germany's largest newspapers. Within 6 hours, it had been translated and republished across French, Italian, Spanish, and Dutch media with the kind of organic editorial consensus that happens when a story is so clear and so resonant that editors across different languages and different political traditions all arrive at the same word simultaneously. Within 12 hours, it was the word that ordinary Europeans were using when they called their local radio stations and wrote to their elected representatives and flooded social media with the kind of genuine, uncoordinated fury that no institutional communications operation on earth knows how to contain, because you cannot spin untouchable. You cannot reframe it. You cannot walk it back without confirming the weakness that walking it back reveals. The word was out. It was burning. And the fire was not staying inside the media cycle where Brussels had learned to manage damaging narratives. It was moving into the polling data, and the polling data was catastrophic. The numbers that leaked to European press outlets in the immediate aftermath of the parliamentary session did not simply confirm public anger at a general level that could be acknowledged and absorbed without structural consequence. They quantified it with a demographic specificity that turned a bad news cycle into something that looked unmistakably like a political ending. In Germany, 61% of respondents said von der Leyen should resign. In France, 57%. In the Netherlands, 64%. These were not the results of surveys conducted in the most Eurosceptic corners of the continent among populations that Brussels had already written off as beyond the reach of pro-European persuasion. These were mainstream Europeans, people who had supported the EU project, people who had trusted Brussels with their economic futures and their children's futures and their sense of participation in something larger and more meaningful than purely national politics. Those people were now saying with absolute clarity and in numbers that could not be explained away as statistical noise that the woman running the European Commission had lost the right to run it. But the number that genuinely alarmed the European establishment, the number that produced the particular quality of fear that arrives when you realize the problem is not the present moment but the future you are building toward, was not the overall resignation figure. It was the demographic breakdown sitting underneath it. The fastest growing constituency demanding von der Leyen's immediate resignation was not elderly conservatives mourning lost national sovereignty. It was not rural populations that EU strategists had long since categorized as structurally resistant to the European project. It was young Europeans between the ages of 25 and 40, the generation that Brussels had spent a decade deliberately cultivating as the bedrock of the European future. The generation that was supposed to inherit the project, believe in it, carry it forward, and eventually become the political class that sustained it into the next half-century of integration. That generation is now the angriest demographic on the continent. And the specific nature of their anger is the detail that makes it most dangerous for the long-term institutional survival of everything the Commission represents. They are not angry at the idea of Europe. They are not rejecting the concept of continental cooperation or shared